universities which know how to do PR as well as he does. Well, in this panel, actually, we hear different concerns coming from different countries. We heard Fernando talking about the concerns in Spain. We heard Robert talking about the concerns in Canada. We will hear Ashok talking about the concerns from an Indian perspective. And I would like to speak about my concerns, about the concerns that I believe represent, as you could hear from other colleagues of mine during the last 2 days, concerns that actually reflects the worryings in Israel in reference to the processes that we are witnessing here. You know, we live in Israel, maybe from the day of independence, more than 60 years ago. We live under this constant Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. When we started to plan this conference, everybody said, well, it's going to be interesting time. Well, it is interesting. We would prefer a little bit more peaceful situation, less concern, less interesting times. But the most interesting process that we're witnessing right now is what is being called the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, no doubt in my mind, the only thing that we generally can say for now, is an authentic process. There is no pre-plan, there is no terrorist organization, nor a state that actually pre-planned this process. It started as a genuine, authentic, popular uprising that has been spreading to other countries, starting from Tunisia, moving on to Egypt, and then onwards. It's too early to judge where it's going to lead. It's too early to judge what will be the end of this process. Would it be a positive end? Are we going to see liberal democracies emerge from this process? Or this process is going to serve as a platform for extremists, political violence activists that will take over those regimes and misuse democracy for that matter. Sometimes, from the Israeli perspective, or some of the Israelis, most of the Israelis, it seems that the international community has a simplistic point of view on this process. This is going to lead to elections, free elections. Free elections as such is a positive thing. It's leading to democracy. And democracy is definitely a positive end. So we are on the fast track to a better world, to a better Middle East, much more stabilized. And it seems that this simplistic approach tends to turn the blind eye to the fact that democracy is not just this instrumental act of free election. Democracy is first and foremost a set of values, democratic liberal values, civil society, protection of the rights of minority, human rights, and so on and so forth. Sometimes we tend to forget cases in which fundamentalists won free elections. And at the end of the day, we find ourselves in one man, one vote, one time. We should ask ourselves in this respect, is Iran, democratic Iran, under Ahmadinejad, Khamenei, and Khomeini, is more democratic than compared to the autocracy of the Shah? We should ask ourselves, is Gaza under Hamas is more democratic than the PA headed by the Fatah? And those elements won free elections. Well, no doubt that from an Israeli perspective, I would assume that from an international perspective, we should have at least some unease in reference to the processes that we are witnessing and which is being called, or so-called, the Arab Spring. We see that already, in a very early stage, there are two problematic outcomes of this process. On one hand, we see the strengthening of jihadi elements, Islamic radical elements. And I refer to Libya, maybe even Yemen down the road, in which you have tribes and warlords that are taking over the central regime. And those tribes and warlords already have connections with local and global jihadi elements, and no doubt that those connections will be strengthened as an outcome of the chaotic situation that is faced after the fall of the regime. In Egypt, the only organized force is the Muslim Brotherhood, which holds an Islamic radical fundamentalist ideology. As an outcome of this chaotic situation in Egypt, we see the decline of the effective control and in Sinai, and Sinai is turning to an uncontrolled, ungoverned territory, which is again being misused by jihadi, local and global elements. But this is only one outcome. The other outcome is the strengthening of the Iranian axis as an outcome of the Arab Spring. We see the Iranian government, the Iranian military, being more engaged and has a growing presence in the Middle East, sending warships. They would never dare to do it under Mubarak, but now they cross the Suez Canal. We see a greater involvement of Hezbollah in those regional conflicts, protecting friendly regimes to Iran on one hand, i.e. Syria, threatening other regimes under the title the Arab Spring, i.e. Bahrain. So no doubt that the Iranians are doing whatever they can in order to exploit this situation to their benefit. But what led to that? As said, this is an authentic historical process that actually reflects genuine grievances of Arab masses. It's a real political protest which is being translated into those riots and rebellions against those regimes. This is the basic eruption of this popular uprising, political protest. But I would argue that this would never happen and definitely would not turn into an epidemic outcome without the backwind of the American foreign policy. I would argue that without the messages, without the attitude that the United States demonstrated towards Mubarak, without the green light, and more than that, that the United States give to NATO to attack Libya, this would not turn into this epidemic outcome, let alone the fact that the United States has been weakened, and this was discussed yesterday, and a weaker United States also send a message to the fundamentalists in the Middle East and in other places around the world that they can actually raise their heads. I spent 2 years ago my sabbatical year at Stanford. And this was the election year of President Obama. Few hours after he gave his historical speech in Cairo, the Cairo speech, in which he tried to reconcile, so-called, with the Muslim world, I was interviewed by the San Francisco TV. And the first question they posed to me was, what is the reaction in Israel to the Cairo speech? I said to them, look, I now live in the Bay Area temporarily. I do not represent the feelings in Israel. But since you ask me, and I'm an Israeli, so we always answer. Even if we don't know the answer, we always have a good answer. So I'll tell you, I think that in Israel we have a mixed feelings toward the speech in Cairo. And they said, could you elaborate on that? I said, of course. It's a combination of hope and concern. Concern because it seems to us that the messages that are being sent there are too simplistic, and therefore they might be dangerous. Hope that we are wrong and he's right and something good will come out of it and we will be one of the first benefactors of that. The second question was, and what is the reaction of the Jewish community in the Bay Area to the speech in Cairo? I said, look, I definitely do not represent the Jewish community in the Bay Area, but since you've asked me, then I would say that in the Bay Area we have, the Jewish community have mixed feelings toward the speech in Cairo. It's a combination of hope and concern. So they said to me, so what's the difference between the reaction in Israel and the reaction in the Bay Area? And they said, in Israel we have much more concern and much less hope than you have in the Bay Area. I have to say that now, 2 years after, in a retrospective point of view, I have even much more concern than I had 2 years ago. And this concern came as an outcome of reading and listening to the speech of John Brennan, the advisor for counter-terrorism for President Obama. John Brennan, in describing the new American counter-terrorism policy, one of the first statements that he gave was, terrorism is not our enemy. Excuse me, Mr. Brennan. You are the counter-terrorism advisor, not the human rights advisor to President Obama. I don't see how can you say that terrorism is not our enemy as the counter-terrorism advisor to the president. Yes, I know. You are playing with words. Terrorism is a tactic. A tactic cannot be an enemy. Therefore, terrorism is not our enemy. Fine. You know what? I can live with that. But I cannot live with the second statement that he gave. Islamists and jihadists are not our enemy. What do you mean Islamists and jihadists are not your enemy? As an outcome of that, I wrote an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post, and I said, if jihadists and Islamists are not your enemy, then who is your enemy? And I actually wrote there, and I mentioned by name, I said, you know what you're doing? By saying that Islamists and jihadists are not your enemy, you are sending a very confusing message to the pragmatic Muslims. Because they know who are the enemies. They know that the jihadists and the Islamists are their enemies. And I mentioned by name President Mubarak, and I said, what is the message that you are sending to President Mubarak by saying the jihadists and the Islamists are not your enemy? A few months after that, it was quite clear what was the message. And therefore, Mubarak found himself in a cage, being tried. No doubt in my mind that President Obama is right by trying to convey the message to the Muslim world as loud and clear as possible that God forbid the Muslims are not the enemy of the United States. The Muslims, Islam is not the enemy of the Western society. It's not the enemy of the world. It's not the enemy of Israel. It's not the enemy of the Jews. But you should have said loud and clear that there is a clear barrier in Islam. And you do not have a problem with Islam. You have a problem in Islam with those Islamists and jihadists and extremists which are misusing Islam in order to convey their very dangerous message and ideology. What President Obama should have done, in my view, is to promote an internal debate in the Muslim society. And he should demand from the Muslims to identify those extremists and to solve the internal problem, not for the sake of the United States, for the sake of Islam itself not being hijacked by those Islamists and jihadists. But when you are sending the message that jihadists and Islamists are not our enemy, then this internal debate would never start. No one should turn a blind eye to this internal problem in Islam. Now, how does this counter-terrorism policy of the United States connected to the Arab Spring? I see a direct connection between the two. First of all, let's elaborate a little bit about the new American counterterrorism policy. Terrorism, anyone who knows me knows already the phrase. I always say that terrorism is an outcome of a very simple mathematical formula that has two factors: motivation and operational capability. And therefore, counterterrorism needs to deal with those two factors at the same time, needs to lower down the operational capability of the terrorists and at the same time deal with the grievances, with the motivations that leads to terrorism. You cannot work and deal only with one factor, both factors. Very difficult to do, but this is the challenge of counterterrorism, wherever terrorism appears. When you analyze the counterterrorism strategy and the policies of those two administrations since 9/11 until today, American administrations, and I refer the comparison between President Bush counterterrorism policy and President Obama counterterrorism policy, you could see immediately some very important differences between the two. It starts with the basic thing of defining the enemy. Who's the enemy? President Bush defined the enemy as terrorism, or if you wish, then later on, global terrorism. President Bush defined that as violent extremists. And down the road, he even limited that, and he said the enemy is Al-Qaeda and the affiliates of Al-Qaeda. As an outcome of the differences in the definition of the enemy, they defined different goals. The goal of President Obama was to exterminate terrorism. And by exterminating terrorism, it didn't refer just to the extermination of terrorist organizations, also dealing with anyone that cooperate with them, states that sponsor them, and so on and so forth. As President Obama set a very lower goal, which is exterminate Al-Qaeda. This is why we see President Obama using extensively, and I'm not criticizing him for that, targeted killings, drone attacks. But can you really eliminate terrorism just by using drone attacks? You cannot. You can lower down the flame temporarily, but this is not going to solve the problem whatsoever. The problem is even bigger than that. When you compare those two administration approaches, President Bush paid more attention and emphasized much more the need to deal with the capabilities and less, although he dealt with that as well, but he was dealing less with counter-motivation, counter-grievances, and so on and so forth. President Obama emphasized the need to deal with the motivations, the grievances that leads to terrorism. But then, when we analyze that, we see that they define those grievances, they define those root causes differently. President Bush defined the root cause of global jihadi terrorism as the Islamic radical fundamentalist ideology, religious ideology. That's the root cause. President Obama defined the root causes as local circumstances, poverty, unemployment, and especially regional conflicts. And from that, of course, you jump to the conclusion that if you solve regional conflicts, then you solve the problem of global jihadi terrorism. If tomorrow morning, and don't get me wrong, it should have happened, but if tomorrow morning we will solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there will not be any more Islamic radicalism. Of course, it doesn't hold water. If tomorrow morning, God forbid, Israel disappear from earth, not because we have peace with the Palestinians that those global jihadists do not support, but because they exterminated Israel, it would not lower the radicalization process in the Muslim world even 1 inch. Just the opposite, probably. What President Obama and his staffers tend to turn a blind eye or forget or misunderstand is that there is a difference between root causes and instrumental causes. Regional conflicts are not the root cause or the root causes of Islamic radicalism, Islamic global jihadi terrorism. They are instrumental causes, no doubt about it. They are being misused as a glue that would unite and brainwash the hearts and minds of the masses. But if you solve one instrumental causes, they would always use another instrumental cause. If the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be solved, then the Kashmirian problem would be the main one. If the Kashmirian problem would be solved, it would be the Bosnian one, and so on and so forth. No shortage in those instrumental causes. But we have to bear in mind that the root cause is the Islamic radical ideology that actually serves as a platform to those ideas. If President Obama would be successful in his ongoing drone attacks, targeted killings, he would be able, and I wish that he would be able, and succeed in that, to cut the head of the snake, or in plural, cut the heads of the snakes. But the body would stay alive, and it will emerge other heads, one after the other, as long as the Islamic radical ideology is live and kicking, and they are turning a blind eye to that specific problem. Going back to the Arab turmoil, it's totally connected. The two are totally connected between themselves. What is going to happen at the end of the process? What will happen if, at the end of the process, Islamists and jihadists will win free election? This would lead to a better world, a safer world. It will be, no doubt in my mind, a very negative outcome, very negative end for that process. Negative and dangerous end to the Arab countries themselves, to the Arab people themselves, to the Middle East, to the Western society, to Israel. If the ideology that gave birth to Al-Qaeda will be the one that would lead the future rulers of Egypt, it will be bad news for the Egyptians, bad news to the Middle East, bad news to Israel, and bad news to the whole world. My friends, it's not a deterministic outcome. Still, I do believe that there is a window of opportunity. A small window which is closing rapidly, but there is a window of opportunity. But in order to calculate our moves, the international moves, in order to create the right policies to deal with this window of opportunity, we first and foremost need to define and be accurate in the definition of who is the enemy, what is the set of goals that we need to put ourselves, and first and foremost understand what is the root cause for this radicalization process in the region and in the world. Thank you very much.